Okay, good morning. We're continuing Yoreh Deah, Basar B'chalav. We are in the middle of Sadi Bet. So we're in the middle of Seif Bet, and we're discussing basically, you have a pot of meat. I don't know, it could be a beef stew, chicken soup, chicken derabanan, but let's just assume any kind of thing on the stove, and cholent, whatever it is. And you have a piece of meat that's half in and half out. Right? It's a full pot, and you have a piece of meat that's sticking out of out of the broth, out of the liquid. And right, okay, that's the classic case for this seif. Okay. All right, we discussed it could be a piece on top of a piece, but okay, the simple case over here is the pieces half in, half out. So the Gershon asked a great question. Why don't we say, so what do we say? If there's a drop of milk lands on the piece of meat, then if it's, we said if it's batal b'shishim, then the whole thing is mutter, right? If that piece of meat is 60 times the amount of that one drop of milk, which is usually the case, if it's just one drop, then you don't even have to take off a kedei klipa, it seems like. So if you look, the pshat of the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah, Shach, and Taz, is in this case, it's true. You do not even have to take off a klipa. Now, we will see when we learn later on, we touched upon this in Ayin Vav with blood. There's a case where something similar happens and you have to take off kedei netila, 2 centimeters. We're going to have this later on more in Tarovis, Kofhei, and around there, where we see it's mashma, a somewhat similar case. You have a hot piece of meat and it's on the flame, and then something touches it, and there we say it's osert ad kedei klipa. So what's the difference over here? So kedei netila over there. Right? When it's something that's really hot and it touches it, and then we will usually say, and if it's kli rishon, we will usually say kedei netila. Okay, ayin sham for the okay. However, so how come over here we see you don't even have to do kedei klipa? So the Pri Megadim says you do have to do kedei netila, but he seems to be a das yachid. The simple reading is you only have to do, you don't have to do anything. Why is that? So the Shach comes out from the Shach, I guess it's about 4 different reasons or possibilities. The Achronim discuss it. Yeah, that's a good question. I forget which one right now. I think it is Gimel. Seif Katan Gimel, I believe. So you see it's discussed by various Achronim how to deal with it. So he gives a few possible answers. Although the halacha l'maisa seems to be the pshat Shulchan Aruch, you don't even have to do kedei klipa because the piece of meat is half in, half out. Just real quickly, some possibilities to answer the question is because milk is considered fatty, and since it's fatty, it's not thick and stagnant. It's fatty, and it'll quickly absorb and move around. We had that expression. By anything that's fatty, it's mifafea. So then it's quick, and it quickly spreads and throughout the thing without sticking in one spot, and it quickly moves, and therefore it's not an issue. Again, there is a whole discussion, is chalav really shamen or not? Okay. Another possibility is it's on a piece of meat that we assume is a very fatty piece of meat. Now, again, we learned already we're not so sure what kind of meat is considered fatty or not. So we're generally machmer in both directions, but it could be you're looking at the piece of meat and you're looking at the fat. It stares you in the face. It's very fatty, and that's the case we're talking about. Okay. Another possibility, he says, is the case in kuf hey, when you have to be more machmer, it's not in a pot. It's a piece of meat, let's say roasting, and there's no liquid over there. And so then it's oser kedei netila. But if it's in a pot, there's so much moisture. There's zeya, there's moisture all over the place. It's full of water, it's sitting in water, and therefore it gives it the koach to, while it's on the eish, to quickly spread it around, and it's not an issue. The fourth thing he says is chalav is very salul, basically very liquidy. If you would have a thick gravy, I don't know, you mix in some flour, or whatever the food is, melted cheese, if you would have a thick substance, then you would need, potentially, it depends which answer you follow, lamaisa, but then you would potentially need kedei natila. But if you're dealing with something just like, thin chicken juice, thin milk, the case is milk, but I would assume would be thin, soup is usually pretty thin, some thick juice from meat, what runs off. Generally, these things we would consider salul, and therefore, so generally speaking, the halacha is the way it is, the way it's written in the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so let's go on. So we left off with the end of the Haggah, the main body of the Ramah. Okay, so we're in the middle of Bet. Haggah. V'chein im lo ni'er klal lo batchila v'lo basaf v'lo kisa klal. So let's say you have a piece of meat, half in, half out, and a drop of milk lands on it, and you don't shake the milk, you don't shake the meat, or you don't cover the pot. Because what happens is if immediately when the milk lands on the meat, you quickly dunk it in and you push it inside underneath the broth and you mix it all together, then even that piece of meat is still kosher as long as the whole thing is batel b'shishim. But what if you don't mix it in, or you don't cover the pot? They do the same, but you want to do it right away. And we're going to see, you don't have to mix it or leave it covered the entire time, just long enough that it mixes in well. Okay? So then it says, I don't know what version you have, your Rama probably says, im yesh shishim bakdera, but the Beis Hillel and the Gra change it to ein. And there's a whole tumult, and all their chonim are like, does it say ein? Is it supposed to say yesh? How does it make sense if it means ein? How does it make sense if it means yesh? And okay, we'll touch upon it, but it's okay. So let's read, I don't know which is an easier read. Maybe it's easier to read im ein. Im ein shishim makdera negativ bat chalav shenafal. Eino asur raka chaticha lavad ushar kadera mutter. So anytime you have this piece of meat half in, half out, and you have a drop of milk land on that piece of meat, that meat was not mixed in, so that meat, if it's not batel b'shishim by itself, to that drop, again, if it's one drop, it often will be, it depends on the size of the piece of meat, but not necessarily. So if it's batel b'shishim, then then that piece of meat will be mutter. But if it's not batel b'shishim in that piece of meat, then the entire pot, everything else in the pot, is going to be kosher. Okay, that's
except that piece of meat.
Except that piece of meat, right? If that piece of meat, well, it depends. That piece of meat all depends if that piece of meat by itself is batel b'shishim or not. If it's 60 times the chalav, but let's assume it's not. So then that piece of meat is always going to be aser. And then the truth is, you can read it yesh, you can read it ein. It doesn't really matter, and that's why the Gra changes it. It doesn't really matter if the rest of the pot is 60 times the drop or not 60 times the drop. It's still going to be, the entire kedera is going to be mutter, because we're assuming that that piece of, that drop stays inside that piece of meat. Again, that's a whole other discussion, but the assumption is, if that piece of meat doesn't move, it's half in, half out, and you don't stir it, then that drop stays inside that piece of meat, and it doesn't go out, and therefore it doesn't affect the rest of the kedera. And we also don't even say, basically we just said, because the Taz points out, once it's in there, it doesn't go out, that's the assumption. And it could be that im yesh shishim, some hold there needs to be shishim. I think the Shach wants to say, no, it should have to say shishim, because then it could be a problem according to the Ri. The Ri says you mitzaref everything. So even though it's half in, half out, it doesn't stay inside that piece of meat, and therefore it can go right out. It's mitzaref the whole thing. You have to be l'ri, also l'chumra. The ri could be lakula, could also be lachumra in this case. So according to the shach, it does need to be shishim, because otherwise, if you don't have shishim, that one tipa, then that one piece of meat, the ri says it's mistarif with the whole pot, and now the whole pot, the milk does travel right through, unlike the taz. So that im shishim. So that's why the shach says there needs to be shishim. But the Taz, the Gra says it should have said ain, because it doesn't even need to be shishim, because it's not going to leave. Okay, that's the whole discussion. And in this case, we do not say Chanan, either similar to like the Taz, because it just, once it's in this one isolated piece, it doesn't leave. It's not a normal case. We're going to see that it becomes Chanan later on, but right now, while it's not moving and it's right there, it just drops in there and it stays in there. Now, and the poskim point out, if you're going to mix it in, then it becomes a problem. As long as you don't mix it in, it doesn't leave. I think that's fine. Now, if there is shishim kenegdo in the entire pot, so the shach says it makes no difference. Mimanav shach bein l'ri bein l'rashi, you're good. Right? That's the shita. That's where the shach learns, because if there's shishim in the whole pot, so according to the ri, the whole pot makes that one piece kosher. And according to Rashi, who says you're not mitzaref the whole pot, well, so then you can't have your cake and eat it too. It's according to Rashi, says you're not mitzaref the whole pot, so that means that milk doesn't aser the whole pot. So that's okay. So anyways, machlokas achronim how to learn this. V'chein im ni'er batchila kisa miyad. Now, if you were to immediately mix in this piece of meat with the rest, or you cover it up, and so therefore, right, all the steam, the zayah is going up and down and all around. You don't have to keep it stirring, and you don't have to keep it covered the entire process. Once you mix it in already, or it's been covered for a little while, so then it's been starif. But you have to cover it or mix it from the very beginning. Shenafal, as soon as it lands, sham ha'isr. Okay, and then it's all mitzaref. As long as you mix it in right away, it's all mitzaref. Fine. What? Then it mixes in with everything, and then you look if there's shishim or not shishim exactly. Okay. Now, what happens if this piece of meat? Let's keep reading. It falls into the soup, the liquid, the broth, or lachatichot, or onto other pieces. So now, let's say a piece of meat, liquid, falls into the pot, and you're not sure where it lands, onto which piece of meat or where in the soup. So then, what should you do? Noer takadera kula. You should immediately mix it all up. So that everything gets mixed up together, since you don't even know what piece to pull out. So if you mix it all together, then the whole thing is mitzaref, levato, and hopefully it'll be batal b'shishim. But now that you mixed it, so if it's not batal b'shishim, it has the taste, then it's aser. But if it is batal b'shishim, it doesn't have the taste, muteret. So then the whole pot becomes muter, and there's nothing aser. And if there's no goy, which we don't use nowadays, so then you just go by shishim. Hagav yeshchokim usvir lahu de'eno mo'il mashenoer hakadera. The Rama says, some argue and say it doesn't help to mix it up right away, because that drop landed on a piece of meat. Let's say it landed on a piece of meat, and you don't, right? The case is, you landed on a piece of meat, and you don't know which piece of meat. So what do we say? Mix it all together, and it's fine. But because according to the Shulchan Aruch, we don't say the principle of Chanan on a suffix, unless you identify which piece. This is in the Shach and the Gra. Unless you identify which piece of meat became basar b'chalav and is chanan, chatichas nasas nevela, the whole thing becomes aser together, then you don't say You don't say Chanan if you don't know what became Chanan. Only once you identify what became Chanan, then now when it gets mixed into something else, that pot needs to be shishim, not connected the drop of milk, but now it has to be connected the Chanan. It has to be shishim connected the whole piece that became treif.
So don't worry about no.
Well, it already happened. It's not. It already happened. Right there. Im lo shenir miyad shenafal eser v'hachi nahug. Therefore, you have to say that one of the pieces is Chanan, and in order to eat from the pot, you have to have shishim not connected the milk, but you have connected that piece. According to the Shulchan Aruch, and you don't know what became aser, you only need shishim connected the drop of milk, as opposed to the entire piece. It's a big nafkamina. It's easy to be batal b'shishim for a drop, but not necessarily a piece of meat.
And then talking about the issue of what is called the yad.
No. The issue is, do you say chanan on something that you don't identify? All right. Taz also says that. Okay, let's go to Gimel. Now, once something becomes aser because of basar b'chalav, a piece of meat. So now what happens? Naset kol chatichat iser. Anytime you have one piece of meat, it gets cooked with milk, and it's not shishim keneged the milk. That piece of meat is now basar b'chalav, and it becomes an iser de'araisa if it was cooked, right? If it was cooked derech bishul, it's an iser de'araisa, and the whole thing becomes a chayfetz of chanan chatichas nases nevela. The entire piece is aser, and it doesn't. This iser de'araisa doesn't apply to shari surim, because shari surim, it's always an iser touches a heter, something treif touches something kosher, and now it imparts through absorption. It takes a piece of the iser and puts it inside the heter. But according to the Shulchan Aruch and Daraisa, it's just a little mixture of iser that it's still a piece of iser inside the mutter. But the whatever is mutter is really mutter. It's just you can't separate them now because it got heated together, it absorbed together. But when it comes to basar b'chalav, you started out with two separate pieces of heter, and it's the mixture itself that transforms both into a chayfetz of iser. So the whole thing now becomes a chayfetz of iser. It's anytime meat and milk touches each other, that milk and that meat, both of them intrinsically, is now an iser de'araisa. So that's why chanan only applies to basar b'chalav according to Shulchan Aruch and only de'araisa. Okay, so let's keep reading. And the Shachan Taz basically explained what we just said. So now, now if you take that piece of meat, and now you cook it with other pieces of meat, sarich shishim levatel kula, you need shishim connected the entire piece of meat, not just that drop of milk. V'im makira, and if, let's say it's in a pot, so you throw in a piece of basar b'chalav meat inside a pot with other meat, a bunch of meatballs. So now what do? If you can tell which piece of meat got thrown in there, then you take out the meat. If there's shishim in the rest of the pot, then you can just take out that one piece of meat, because that piece of meat's finished. It's basar b'chalav. So you take it out and don't eat that. And the rest, you can eat it, because that's not that one piece. And we're talking about a case that it was batal b'shishim. If it's not batal b'shishim, then the whole thing becomes aser, finished. V'im eno makira. Let's say the whole thing is batal b'shishim, but you can't identify which meatball, which piece of meat was the one that got the milk in there. What do? Im eno makira harotev butter. So then, whatever is for sure not that piece of meat, the rotev, the juice, right, the broth, all that is butter. But the kol hachatichos asuros im chatichat eser litkabed. If all those pieces of meat are a large piece of beef, not a little meatball. They're all a nice sized piece of steak. So that's lit kabed. So then we see there's a principle, right? We're going to see this later on. At afilu be'elef labatil, it's really kabed. We can't be mevatel. So then and you know which is which. So therefore, it's not mevatel, and they're all aser. But if they're all little pieces of, which is usually whenever you have a soup or meatballs, they're usually small pieces of chunks, and I don't think they're going to be uyalis kabed. So then,
like a giant meatball and everybody gets one, right? Then there's no way.
okay, maybe a giant meatball would satisfy. That's the whole sugya of uyalis kabed, but theoretically, that could be correct. Okay, a big piece of meat, and that's would be okay. All right, let's go on. Dalit. Lo amru chaticha atzmanas as nevela. We don't say that the piece of meat itself becomes a nevela, right? That's chanan, chaticha atzmanas as nevela. We don't say that. Ela bebasar b'chalav. The only time we say chanan is by basar b'chalav, as we just explained. Aval lo b'shar yisurim. Shulchan Aruch says there's no principle, there's no halacha there's no rule of chanan by other yisurim. Kegon, kazayis chaylev sheniva b'chaticha. You have a piece of fat, tray fat, that absorbs heat into another piece of meat. Ve'ein b'shishim levatlo v'nesra. So if there's no shishim, so now that everything became aser, that new piece of meat that touched the chaylev becomes aser. V'nesra. V'achar kach bishlei macherot. If you are now to take that piece of meat, a kosher piece of meat that became treif because of the chaylev, and now you're going to cook it into another pot. Ein tzarich ela shishim kedei kazayis chaylev. You only have to have shishim in the pot neged the chaylev, as we just explained. Vaz afilu chaticha atzma chozeret liyot muteret. And then even that piece of iser now becomes mutter. Continue to cook it, and it becomes mutter. Haga v'yesh omrim, but the Ramah says no. The Amrinan bechol ha'yisurim chaticha na'ases nevela. That by all yisurim we say chanan. All right. V'chein haminhag. This is the Rabbanan. V'chein haminhag pashut v'ein l'shanos. But this is the minhag, and this is the straight halacha, and there's nothing you can do about it. Obviously, in rare cases and sveikas, there's what to think about. But otherwise, in normal case, that's it. It's aser. Davka ima eser davuk bechatichat heter, o shachaticha kula chutz larote v'nafal alea eser. So the Ramah says, but it only becomes chanan if it's attached or it was completely out of the pot totally. A little bit similar to the case of the ri, the way he understands. It's the piece of meat that's completely out of the pot. And then it touches that one piece of meat that's dry and solid, not in a liquid. It's completely dry, and that's when it gets, it becomes treif. But if you have a piece of meat and it's half in, half out of the liquid of the broth, and it's not attached to it, lo amrinan chaticha nasa nevela. We don't say chaticha chanan. Umitzaref kol kadir levatel eser, and you could use the entire pot to be mevatel eser. Okay, right? We learned by basar b'chalav, the initial drop, it doesn't, at that initial moment, that one piece doesn't become chanan, but once you let it sit there and then you mix it in, or take it out and put it with another pot, then that is chanan. But the Ramah says, for shari surim, we don't say that. If it was half in, half out, in that case. Okay, umikol makom, yesh la'achmer le'asar ota chaticha, but that piece should be aser. Because ze b'shari yisurim, and that's by other yisurim. Or basar b'chalav, again, he's repeating himself. But when it comes to basar b'chalav, afal pi she'ena iser davuk, even though it's not attached, u'miksa chaticha toch harotev, and even though only part of it is in, part of it's out, arminan chatichas nasas nevela, yesh omrim. Okay, the lo amrinan chaticha nasa nevela im nitarev iser lach beheter lach, and then some say we don't say chanan if it's lach belach. V'achar kach nitarev hakol beheter, and all becomes mixed together with heter afterwards with another lach. Ve'in tzarich rak shishim neged the iser, and you only need shishim keneged the iser. not the entire mixture. Shenafal, that fell in there. Yesh lismach al zeh b'shari yisurim, and that's the halacha by shari yisurim. Tzorech hefsir gadol, when it is tzorech hefsir gadol. Aval lo b'basar b'chalav. B'basar b'chalav, even if the mixture is lach b'lach, then we can still say chanan. V'im nit'arev. V'im nit'arev yavesh b'yavesh, lo amrinan b'shem eser chatichas nases nevela. The only time you say chanan by shari yisurim is it's lach b'yavesh, not yavesh b'yavesh. And lach b'lach, we said, depends if it's hefsed merub, but tzarech gadol or not. Okay, but yavesh and yavesh, never. Okay, keep going. Let's just finish this line. How do you read? V'ayin later on, midin chatir nevela, kliya nesar mebliat iser, lo amrinan be chatichas nases nevela, v'lo binan shishim keneged iser shabala. When it comes to a pot, that it gets with a bliya of iser into a pot, on that the whole pot doesn't become chanan, it's only keneged the bliya. Okay, we'll see when we get there. That's later on.